So this is a movie that we've both seen before, and I don't want to fully speak for you, but I've seen this several times. And I've
Me too.
seen this, yeah, I've seen this on TV and I've seen this on VHS or HBO or wherever it would play on a cable network where you would see it more so uncut. So I've seen both versions of this. And
Yeah.
I would 100% say you have to see the uncut version. Not that this is just some salacious film, but if you cut out a lot of the key elements, then it's just neutering this animal that we have here. It's an interesting movie, not as controversial as I thought it would be. Coming back into this, I'm like, man, the first thing that pops in my head is, this is one of those movies that they couldn't make today. Because when I think of movies, comedies during that era, I think of like Animal House. I think that was made around the same time, maybe.
Yeah.
And I think of like, something made a little bit afterwards, like Revenge of the Nerds. And I think of these movies, I'm like, there's no way you can make those movies today. And then I watch this, I'm like, no, this is very remakeable. It's kind of tame almost based on my expectations. What about yourself? How did you feel about that aspect of it?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I like you. I watched this movie a lot of times. This is one of my childhood favorites. So I watched it every time it was on TV, and then I eventually got the VHS tape and watched that multiple times, and then upgraded to DVD. Now I have the Blu-ray. So it's a movie that's never been too far away from me. But I find watching it now, it's amazing to me how well it still works and how fresh it is in a way. I think in some ways it is kind of shocking because we've gotten used to this sort of politically correct kind of thing where you don't say certain words and you don't portray certain attitudes. But yeah, I think it could be made today. I don't know whether they would do it right if they did it, but I think it's a movie that still holds up and works really well as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Yeah, when I say that, I don't know when's the last time you've seen Revenge of the Nerds or Animal House, but there's like rape going on in those movies. Yeah. There's sexual
Yes.
assault, and these guys are the heroes. So,
Yeah.
there's more mean-spirited things going on. There's nothing mean-spirited about this movie at all. The racists get their comeuppance. The people who were good, who did bad things, they learned their lessons pretty quickly and were very lovey-dovey with the
Yeah.
black characters. It was all kind of kumbaya
Yeah.
almost. It was almost too safe. I'm like, this is it. I was like, okay. Yeah, it felt very, very, very safe for the mid 70s, but maybe I'm overstating it. Maybe it'd be too risque for 2023, which is almost 50 years. So,
Yeah.
uh, yeah, which says maybe we've made progress. But as far as
Yeah.
the movie itself, aside from controversy and all that other stuff, it's still very funny. There are a lot of the jokes that don't really last with time. A lot of the references just kind of like go over your head. You almost have to pause it and Google to figure out like, is this a joke? Why is this funny? But I say for the most part, a few references aside, it's still hilarious. Still, there were a few times where I just laughed out loud. The time where Mel Brooks, who I think is like too over the top, but to me this was almost his best performance that I can remember. There's the particular scene I'm thinking of is where he's grabbing the soon-to-be sheriff, thinking he's talking to his cohort, and he's like, "We can't let a," and then he
Yeah.
looks
Yeah.
up.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So then he switches who he's talking to, and he still says
Yeah.
Nick.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there were a few times where I was just laughing out loud, which is not always the case. Where you've seen it several times, you know the punchline, you know where it's coming. All these jokes, none of it's new to you. And again, it's old jokes, 50-year-old jokes, but it's still hilarious to me.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and that's one of my favorite moments, the one you just described there. But yeah, I think Mel Brooks. I mean, he's very into the shtick, the comedy shtick, and he fully commits to it. So he is very over the top, and that's kind of what makes it work. Like if he was just doing it half-heartedly, you would think, that's no good. But he just fully commits, and you know, a lot of those sort of old jokes, as we call them, they've been around a long time for a reason, you know, because audiences do find them funny, you know, certain shticky things that just work. And I've experienced it too, and you know, working in theater and hearing the audiences react. You know, it's often the joke that you think, oh, that's too silly, and that's the one that works. Everybody loves it. So, but yeah, I found myself laughing many times throughout this movie, even though I've seen it so many times I could probably almost do the dialogue along with it, but I was still laughing. You know, it still makes me laugh. It's still a very funny movie. And interesting about the references, because when I was a kid, I didn't know any of the references really. Like I had no idea who Marlene Dietrich was. I didn't know that you know, Madeline Kahn was doing an impression of Marlene Dietrich. I had no idea. You know, to me this was just a funny scene. I just enjoyed it for what it was. And so when I got older and I saw, oh gee, this is a reference to that, you know, then I appreciated the movie all the more. So as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't matter whether people get all the references or not, you know, because the movie still kind of works for what it is. And to me, that's the mark of a great comedy.
I saw this one scene and it kind of encompasses everything we're just talking about in one like 2-3 minute scene. It's when they're standing on the line for the henchman, where he puts out an ad for henchmen. And
Yes.
this was a scene I think done in Deadpool 2 when he got the X Factor team together, where he put out an ad. Deadpool put out an ad for henchmen or for a team, and that's where he formed X Factor. And it's just a bunch of people standing on line saying why they should belong in. And that scene, not just in Deadpool 2, but between Deadpool 2 and this, it's been redone so many times. So that's just an example of some of these gags that just don't get old. Also, standing on line, you have the Ku Klux Klansmen, and you have that classic scene where it's just like, all right, how are we going to get past these guards? Oh, let's call these people over, knock them out, and wear their suits. This may have done this, I'm sure this was done several times before this, but it was also done after it. One of those, again, timeless gags. And then, of course, where they get the information they need, and instead of just walking away, the black character then just goes to sign the piece of paper and they see that he's black, you know. Again, these aren't like fresh jokes, but they're hilarious, you know. And again, I mean, off the top of my head, I can't think of it, but I'm sure there have been plenty of scenes where there have been Ku Klux Klanmen, you know, knocked out, people take their place, and then they do something to reveal who they are inadvertently, you know. I think even Dave Chappelle kind of did something like this on his show, where you had the black Klansman who was blind, but he didn't know he was black, you know? So, I don't know, it's just a lot there. You also have, talking about references that people may not get, there was the Mexicans who went up and they signed up, and the guy was like, here's your badges. And he's like, badges? We don't need those stinking badges. That was a reference to Treasure of the Sierra Madre, which is a film we should be reviewing at some point.
Yes,
as well. Yeah. And that's a reference from that movie. That's a reference you may not get, but you're still seeing something that's funny on screen. And then, of course, you have the iconic meme of where the white women at, you know, when they convince. And all of that I just mentioned, not only does it sum up a lot of the things we were just talking about, it all happens within just a couple minutes of each other.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, as a kid, I loved that too. Just when the camera goes down the line and you see all these different people, you see bikers, you know, you see Nazis, you see all these people who, of course, wouldn't be there in the Old West, you know, but it's hilarious, you know. And I love the moment too where the guy at the front of the line is chewing gum, you know, and Hedley says, well, I hope you brought enough for the rest of us, you know, which is something that we can all kind of identify from being in school. You know, they don't let you chew gum. And, you know, moments like that, just as a kid, I thought were hilarious. And they still work today, you know, because they're just so silly, right? It's just...
it's very silly. To me, another funny part in that scene, too, is the biker. And you hear the bike going, But then when
Yes.
they pan down, it's just a handlebar.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
then later on in the scene where he's on the horse, but he's holding the handlebars for the bike, and you still hear the sound effects. So
Yeah,
again, that's just one scene. All that we just talked about for several minutes, the scene is shorter than our conversation about that, and
that's
it's
right.
another reason why the movie is such a classic. There's also the buddy aspect of it as well, that I think you want to get into.
Yeah, one of the reasons that I love this movie, and I think it transcends a lot of other similar movies, because it's a pretty crazy comedy. Like when you look at it on the surface, it's a crazy comedy. It's really out there. It's silly. It's ridiculous, but there is also it has a lot of heart. It has a lot of real human emotion in it, and you can kind of take it seriously at times. Like not just the themes, but this relationship between the two main characters, Bart, the sheriff, who is the main character of the story, and Gene Wilder's character, Jim, also known as the Waco Kid, the old gunfighter. Their relationship, to me, is the heart of the movie. It's the center of the movie, and we spend a lot of time with them, and Jim, he doesn't show up until half an hour into the movie, but then the two of them spend a lot of time together, and they get to know each other, and they talk about their background and their lives, and you can really you feel their friendship growing, and the bond, and it's almost like a romantic storyline, except it's not. It's a friendship, right? It's a growing friendship. They might call it a bromance these days, or 10 years ago or something, but it's something about that really makes the movie. It elevates the movie to me. It's not just a silly comedy. You can actually feel real emotion for these guys. And when Jim talks about the reason he gave up gunfighting and started to drink, because he almost shoots a 6-year-old kid, like you feel that as a real emotional moment. It's not just a silly joke. And
Well,
to
they
me
do
that
end it
carries.
with a silly joke, because then he
They
said he
do.
walked away and the kid shot him in the ass.
That's
So,
true. They do, but it feels like a real moment, like a
yeah,
real
yeah.
this is why somebody would give it up, and it carries right through to the end of the film, their friendship, and they ride off together at the end. So to me, that is a major part of this film for me, was the relationship between those two characters.
Yeah. Speaking of riding off together, let's talk about the ending. So, I'm not a big fan of breaking the fourth wall, or movies that are great and then they decide to divert at the end, almost like they don't know how to end their movie, and the ending feels kind of slapped on, or isn't in continuity with finishing the story that's being told. So as a kid, literally up until this last rewatch reviewing of the movie, I never liked the ending. I'm like, just finish your story. Why do we
Wow.
have to reveal that it's a real set? Why do we have to have this song and dance stuff, and breaking characters and going in and out of character, and they're in the West, now they're in the real world, now they're West real world. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's the fact that I was just annoyed by that. Maybe it was just over my head. I didn't really appreciate it until this recent watching. I think I've mentioned before on a previous reviews that I think when we did the King of Comedy, when we were talking about Scorsese, I hate the ending for um, Goodfellas, because like, just finish your movie. Why does he have to start talking to the camera? But here, I think it worked. I think it worked really well. And again, it didn't really dawn on me till this rewatching of it, because it's not just that they break character, but how brilliantly they weave back and forth between back to the movie, back to breaking the fourth wall. It's a movie, it's real. It's a movie, it's real. It's a movie and it's real. It's almost like sleight of hand, you know.
Yeah.
Then it's suddenly it's the movie again, but Gene Wilder's eating popcorn. But I thought it
Yeah.
was a movie. Okay,
Yeah,
then he puts down the popcorn, they're back to the movie, and then they ride off. But no, they don't ride off. They go to a limo. Yeah.
that's
And
right.
then
Yeah,
the guy escapes in the theater and he's watching the movie that we're watching. Then he
yeah,
goes outside and he's back in the movie again. So I think all of that was brilliantly done. And I'm ashamed to say it didn't really dawn on me how brilliant it was until this new reviewing of the movie.
yeah. That's really interesting because I did love the ending as a kid, and I still love it today. It's the final 10 minutes of the movie, and I think it's absolutely brilliant. You know, like because they have been breaking the fourth wall throughout the movie, where characters will turn and talk directly to us. They'll make these references, you know, that couldn't possibly fit into the time period, referring to Hedy Lamarr and stuff like that, Randolph Scott. But anyway, to me, it is absolutely brilliant. Like you say, they break through the wall. They're in another movie. They get into a fight, and one of my favorite lines in the movie is when Taggart says, "I'm working for Mel Brooks," right before he punches the other guy, and then they run out of the studio, and Headley goes to the movie theater, and it's, yeah, to me it's absolutely brilliant that it's showing the movie, and he goes in to watch the movie, and he sees Bart arriving outside the theater, which is why he gets out of the theater and has the final confrontation. And so, yeah, I love all that stuff, and it's, I would describe it as, when I watch that, it's kind of like my brain feels like it's on fire, because there's just so many really good ideas that are coming together here, and it's just all working. And to me, it's like the brilliant climax of all the sort of postmodern touches that have happened before in this movie. And as a guy who was trying to write plays and other things, I often thought, how could I write something as good as this? And I couldn't even figure out how to do it, like without ripping this off completely. Like, once this has been done, how can you redo it? Like, it's just so perfectly done here. It would just be a ripoff of Blazing Saddles. So, yeah, to me, it's one of my favorite parts of the movie.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant film. It again, some of the stuff on screen, some of the references may go over your head because it was made 50 years ago. But aside from not getting a few references, which you can just Google in like 5 seconds, the movie is brilliant. It's still funny. It made me laugh out loud. It made me reappreciate the things that I did like about it, and it made me appreciate things that I didn't even like about it on the first few viewings until recently. So I couldn't recommend it enough. One of the greatest comedies ever made, one of Mel Brooks's best films, one of Gene Wilder's best films as well.
Yeah, I agree. And a lot of people will say Young Frankenstein is his best film, but for me, Blazing Saddles is my favorite. I mean, I loved Young Frankenstein. I loved some of the others, but Blazing Saddles is the one that, it was the first one I saw, and I keep coming back to it. I just love it. And I don't know if they could make it today and make it as good as it was then, but to me, I'm just glad that it's still here, and you can watch it and enjoy it, and it'll always be here. So I think that's great.
Let's talk a little bit about the music for the movie. I think I mentioned previously that it almost feels like something that belongs on Broadway. I've seen a lot of shows, and I'm sure Mel Brooks has done a ton of shows as well, because he seems like a guy who is just as good as doing stuff for the stage as he is for the big screen. Obviously, this was his peak time because he was just on fire with his movies, talking about The Producers and this and Young Frankenstein. Those are three of the greatest comedies ever made, and it's all from one guy within a short period of time. But music has always been a big part of his movies, and obviously when you're talking about the stage, it's always a big part of stage as well. What were your thoughts on the music in the movie?
Well, I love it, and I think you're right that Mel Brooks is always including musical numbers in his movies. I think every single movie he made has at least one number in it, and The Producers, of course, being about producing a musical. But this one almost feels like a musical. There's so much music in this one. It's not, but it almost feels like it. And I think this must be another way that he was really influential on me, because he was really influential on me. His style of satire, poking fun at movies, that's something that I loved to do even from an early age. When I was trying to write things, I would often be writing a spoof of something, a slasher film possibly. But I also fell into doing musicals, when I was a little bit older. And at that point, I don't think I even realized what a big influence he had been on me. But eventually I kind of went, wait a minute, yeah, this is all sort of coming from Mel Brooks, because he has all these wonderful musical numbers. And in this movie, of course, the theme song, I think, is so brilliant. And it's one of the ones that he didn't actually write the music for, but he wrote the lyrics. And the lyrics are brilliant because it's kind of playing off that idea that every old Western movie has a song that kind of uses the title of the movie in it. And even though the title doesn't really mean anything, in this case, Blazing Saddles, he rode a blazing saddle. What does that even mean? But it sounds like a perfectly legitimate song from an old Western. If you don't listen to the words, you would actually think, yeah, this is a good song, and it is a good song. It's very catchy. And I think you may have commented that Frankie Lane, the singer, Frankie Lane, right? Yeah. He apparently Mel Brooks advertised for a singer to sing this song, and he said, I want somebody like Frankie Lane. And then Frankie Lane actually said, hey, I can do it. And so Mel Brooks hired him, and he didn't tell him that it was a comedy. And he sang it like it was totally serious. And I think that's exactly what he needed to do, because with satire, the worst thing you can do is look like you're trying to be funny. That's kind of the worst mistake you can make. You want to take it very seriously. And Frankie Lane does that with this song. And as a result, it is funny, but it's also just a great, catchy song. And whenever I see the movie, I find myself singing that song for the next 2 days. I can't stop. It's just so catchy. What do you think about that song?
I love it. And Frankie is someone that did a bunch of songs for Westerns, TV shows, and movies. And you're right, with Westerns, it was a thing that if you did a Western, you had to have a song. Necessarily have to have the title of the movie in it, but it generally described what was happening in the movie. I remember notoriously Rancho Notorious was one of those where Fritz Lang hated that he had to force that song in there. But yeah, that was a thing. And speaking of Brooks, as far as with doing stage and doing music, he's someone that's won a Grammy and a Tony as well. So he's done it all as far as that stuff goes.
Yeah, and I think he actually wrote a musical before he made a movie. He actually wrote a musical that failed, and then he made The Producers, and so he became a successful filmmaker. But he'd already tried that. He'd already tried a musical, and then
are you saying before he did the Blazing Saddles, where he ends it with life imitating art, imitating life, imitating art, he actually did life imitating art because he did a play that failed, then did a movie about a play that failed? So
I think so. Funny. Yeah, I think so. And then, of course, famously, many, many years later, The Producers was turned into the biggest smash musical on Broadway. So it kind of came full circle. He started with a failed attempt, and then he had the biggest hit on Broadway. So he's never been far away from musicals. He's obviously very interested in that. He's very talented. I mean, he didn't write the music for the theme song, but he wrote the music for 3 other songs, plus the lyrics in Blazing Saddles, including the Rock Ridge song, where they all sing about how their town is, everything's going wrong with their town, everything, all this bad stuff is happening. And it turns out that the choir is actually singing this song in the church, which I found kind of funny as well. But it's a funny song, and I mean, the pièce de résistance, I guess, is the Lili Von Shtupp number, which feels exactly like a Marlene Dietrich number, and it's just so well done. So yeah, I can't imagine a Mel Brooks movie without Mel Brooks songs in the movie. I think that's a huge part of who he is.
Yeah, the music was good. Also, the script was good. I think this didn't start off as a original script by Mel Brooks. I think he got like a 30 to 40 page treatment for it, and he loved it. But I generally just direct things that I write, and they're like, "Hey, this is just a skeleton. You know, you can fill it out." And I think he got some other writers on board. But yeah, writer, director, music, he did it all, even acting. But the script is really good as well. We talked about the references. The plot is good. The ending is good. Everything is very tight with the script, and he did bring in a lot of different points of views. Like I said, he didn't start off with the original version of the script, but he did contribute to writing it. And then he also went in a black perspective, and that's when he brought Richard Pryor in there as well. I think he even joked that Mel Brooks wrote most of the dialogue for the black sheriff, and then Richard Pryor wrote for some of the white characters, like Mongo and some of the other characters. So, and it kind of makes sense, because if you're white and you're doing a movie about a black character not fitting in, you don't want to necessarily have someone as crass as Pryor can be at times writing for the black character, because you may not end up with the type of comedy that Mel Brooks does. You know, it could have more of the personality of a Richard Pryor film if Richard Pryor wrote for the sheriff. So I mean, I obviously I wasn't there in the writing room, but just knowing Richard Pryor's sense of humor, knowing that time in the 70s that we were in, I think if Richard Pryor was the head writer, or if he was writing for that lead sheriff character, you may have ended up with a little bit of a darker comedy than the feel-good comedy you got with Blazing Saddles.
That's possible, and what I've always heard over the years is that Richard Pryor just really loved the character of Mongo. He just really loved that character, and he just wanted to write for that character. So he came up with almost all the material for Mongo, and it's great stuff, you know. So I think it's just a, you know.
Does Mongo even talk that much?
He does. He has that great line about how he's just a pawn in the game of life.
Oh,
so he's kind of like a
Mongo's pawn in Game of Life.
that's right. But you know, all the gags like punching the horse and stuff like that. You know, I guess Richard Pryor just really was inspired by that, and you know, I think he was just part of the team, and it's like whatever you feel like writing, whatever ideas you have, you know, just contribute, and that was one of the things he really contributed on.
Yeah. And you would think someone who does everything like he does would have this giant ego. But like you said, he just let Richard Pryor come in. He didn't like dictate what he should be writing. I'm sure he didn't bring Richard Pryor in saying, you know what, I got this Mongol character. I know the perfect guy to write it, Richard Pryor. So obviously that wasn't a pre-planned thing that's the character and that's what Richard Pryor is going to do when he comes on board. It's more so, hey, we're doing this movie that's going to use the N-word. Let's get a legitimate black comedian, someone to bring that culture into the room. And like you said, he let him do what he wanted in that writing room. And again, he took a script that wasn't originally his. He brought them on. He brought those writers on board in the writing room as well. So he's, as much as control as he has, he seems like a giving person from a creative standpoint.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess it was kind of a throwback to his early days when he was a writer on Sid Caesar's Show of Shows, which is a comedy show that actually had a lot of famous writers work on it, including Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner, Neil Simon, and Neil Simon's brother, who also was a very successful TV comedy writer. So I think he was trying to recreate the magic of that, where they had a room full of writers, probably before that was a thing. You know, like that's become a common thing in modern times to have the writer's room. But I think at this time it was probably not quite so common, and he kind of wanted to create that magic of having a bunch of funny people in the room and seeing what happens, you know, like let's just inspire each other and see where we go.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about the music, the direction with Mel Brooks, the script. let's get into the cast. So we already brought up Richard Pryor, and I think with Mel Brooks, he didn't just want Richard Pryor writing it. I think he wanted him to play that sheriff character. But Richard
He
Pryor
did.
obviously has his huge run-ins with drugs and the law, and the studio just didn't feel good about having Richard Pryor play the lead. Now, who knows how much Brooks actually went to bat for him? Maybe he had his reservations as well. I mean, it's easy to say after the fact, oh, Richard Pryor's a genius, I would want him in the part, but he's a producer. This is his movie as much as it's a studio's movie. He had final cut. He's writing songs, he's writing the script, he's acting, he's directing. So, I mean, sure, if he said, we're going to have Richard Pryor in this movie or we're not making this movie, I'm sure they would have caved. So I think he did went to bat for him, but he probably saw that, listen, this isn't the hill I want to die on, because, I have an actor that may die on me. If he has
Yes.
like some bad high or something. So I think historically it would have been great to say that Richard Pryor starred in this movie, because Richard Pryor is one of the great black comedians. It's not like this lead actor who did a great job.
Yeah.
It's like he went on to have like this huge career. This was kind of like the highlight for him. And you would have had the pairing of Wilder and Pryor in this movie, and they went on to do a bunch of movies together, and this would have been the biggest one that they would have been on screen together as a duo. And as you mentioned, that whole buddy aspect of the movie is a big part of it as well.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy that those guys went on to kind of become a comedy team together, making a bunch of movies, because I think prior to this, Richard Pryor hadn't really, like, he was in some movies, but he wasn't like a big movie star prior to this, and he became one, and he and Gene Wilder really had a string of successful movies. So yeah, it would have been interesting, if they had been in this together. But I have to say that I do really like Cleavon Little, and I mean, this is where I know him from. I don't know him from anywhere else, but I think he's so good in this movie. It's hard for me to imagine anyone else doing it. And of course, when I was a kid, I had no idea, like, this was the movie. I had no idea that anyone else might have been in it or might not have been in it. So to me, it was just the reality. And I do really like him in this movie. I think he's good.
This is the one thing you know him from. So that kind of reiterates my point. Yes. But you're right. He did a great job. There's nothing wrong with his performance at all. I think he adds to the movie. He's not just there for the ride. He adds to it. I just thought it would have been interesting if Richard Pryor was in it, but the movie works because he works. They were one of the last comedy duos, I think. I mean, because we always had Laurel and Hardy.
Yeah.
You have
Abbott and Costello.
I think there was one more duo. Obviously, you have the Three Stooges and the Marx Brothers, which were more than duos.
Yes.
But they were like comedy teams as well. I think there's a couple people I'm forgetting. But I think after this, you didn't really have that many comedy teams after this. I know you had Chris Farley and David Spade, but then obviously Farley tragically died young. But they're right up there with some of the top comedy team duos up there.
Yeah. I think at the same time, Cheech and Chong were kind of successful duo, but yeah, that's something you don't see that much of anymore. And this may be an out of place comment, but there was another old comedy team called Olson and Johnson, and Mel Brooks is making direct reference to them with one of the names of his characters, Olson Johnson, because everyone in town is named Johnson. But that's an old comedy team, and I remember my dad telling me, they were a comedy team, and they made a great movie called Hellzapoppin'. I don't know if you've ever seen Hellzapoppin', but it's worth seeing, and in a way, it's kind of a forerunner to Mel Brooks, because they do some of the same crazy kind of breaking the fourth wall stuff, and it's just very interesting. But that movie's largely forgotten. For some reason, it was hugely popular in its day, but I don't know if it's even officially available now.
Also, as far as the other lead character that eventually ended up going to Gene Wilder,
the Waco Kid,
he originally wanted this part. Brooks didn't want him. He didn't look rough enough, old enough. Yeah. And then he ended up going with a few different options that all failed on him before he ended up coming back to him. This actually hit home for me because I did a movie called, almost embarrassed to say the name of it, but it did make me a lot of money. It's a long time ago. Um, I guess I have to say the name of it since I'm referencing it. It's called Mandingo Sex Addict. So the original title of the film was called Tortured by Regret. But prior to releasing that, I'd released a movie called The Trade-Off. And what I was doing with my titles is I was giving descriptive titles to movies that kind of said it was a description of what's going on in the movie. So the title let you know, it was almost like The Cat and the Canary, where it's like the title plays into the movie and the movie plays into the title. But the
Yes.
trade-off didn't make as much money as I thought it should. So I spoke to one distributor. He's like, this title sucks. I even spoke to a filmmaking friend of mine, and he's like, yeah, this sounds like some kind of romance novel. So I'm like, okay, the title describes the movie, but it's not going to sell any DVDs or it's not going to stream well. So I'm like, what should I do? And the distributor's like, all right, what's the movie about? It's about this guy who keeps destroying his relationships because he's addicted to sex. He's like, he's a sex addict. All right, give me more. I was like, he's black, Mandingo sex addict. And that's kind of how the title came together. But in doing the movie, the trade-off, the guy who was playing the secondary lead that I played off of in the movie, he was someone that I really liked as an actor, and he was in a few of my movies. I'm like, you know what? I need to kind of mix things up. If we're keep playing off against each other, the movies are going to feel too similar. So he's a good actor, but I'm like, you know what? I got to skip on him for this. I ended up going with some other people. I went with this guy who had a bunch of IMDb credits, and at the time, like, I was the only one giving people IMDb credits. I'm like, all right, he got experience. He's worked in some other productions, so I brought him as part of the movie. He ended up acting like really weird, and then at some point he just walked off set and disappeared off the face of the earth. And then I was kind of stuck. I was already shot some scenes, and I ended up calling him in. He ended up doing a great job and bailed me out. So obviously on a much, 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 much smaller case and situation, but I kind of went through the same thing where it's just like, hey, you have this reliable actor, you work with him before, you love his performance, but you don't think he's the right fit. And sometimes you just kind of have to give the actor credit that they'll adjust to the part or they'll make it work, rather than going off in different directions with people who may be unreliable. That's kind of what Mel Brooks did. He went to John Wayne. I think the story is John Wayne loved it, but he just didn't think he was the right fit. That to me sounds like the Hollywood story, the publicist story. But I don't think John Wayne would do anything that made him look bad, because
Yeah.
he turned down a lot of other stuff. I think Ride the High Country, he turned down. He's turned out a lot of things that would make him look bad. I think he
Yeah.
always just wanted to be the cool guy that, saved the day, and didn't want to look kind of too tarnished with his image, especially later on in his career, as this would have been. So,
Yeah.
for whatever reason, John Wayne said no. He went with Gig Young, who is a good actor, but a guy who had alcohol problems. And the story goes that Brooks thought, man, this guy's really good. He really seems like he's hungover, and he's twitching. Man, he's showing
Yeah.
really good signs of an alcoholic. And then they actually had to call an ambulance because he was an alcoholic, and
Yeah.
ended up firing after the first day of shooting and then calling in Wilder.
Yes. Well, Mel Brooks made the mistake of thinking, I want an old, broken down alcoholic guy to play an old, broken down alcoholic, but not really the best idea. Just get an actor who can pretend to be an old, broken down alcoholic, and you'll be much further ahead. And I have to say, I'm shocked that Gene Wilder wasn't the first choice. I mean, I think he's wonderful in this. I think he's perfect in this. And much like Cleavon Little, I can't imagine anybody else, playing the role. But I guess it's just, I'm so used to it. But I don't think it would have been right if you had someone like John Wayne or another old, broken down actor. It would really change it. It wouldn't feel as right to me
And
as
John
it
Wayne's
does now.
not funny. Like, how would those dynamics work with him and
Yeah,
Little? The age gap and the fact that this movie is a comedy. How
yeah.
would any of that work?
I don't think we would see the same successful bonding kind of, the friendship. I don't think we'd see it as much if it was John Wayne or even someone else who was really old. I think it would maybe take on a father-son relationship, maybe if it was working, but I don't know. I don't think it would have worked as well.
I could see it working like in like a City Slickers type way,
Hmm.
but in that case, they weren't buddies though. It just happened to have an older grizzled actor and a younger comedian playing off of
Yes.
each other. But I just couldn't. I don't know. I think it would have been a mistake. I think he's lucky when he turned him down.
Oh yeah. And I think, to me, it never struck me that he was too young because he was called the Waco Kid. So I assumed he was quite young when he was a gunfighter. And so that this might be 10 years later, and he's not that old because he was so young as the Waco Kid.
Mhm.
Just
Yeah,
made sense.
yeah. And this was a great time for Wilder because he worked with Brooks previously on The Producers, and he was writing Young Frankenstein with Brooks while they were shooting this, which is again another huge hit. You're talking about within like a 5 6 year span where they made three of the greatest comedies ever, and
Hmm.
then within that span, Wilder did Willy Wonka as well. So
Hmm.
Wilder, who's not really a name that people talk about when you talk about movie stars and you talk about great comedians, I can't think of anybody who brings up Gene Wilder. I mean, we bring up Richard Pryor, we already did in this
Hmm.
podcast, but how many people in the acting circles or in the comedy circles bring up Gene Wilder towards the top of their list? No one does. But during this like 6 year span, he did some of the greatest movies, comedy movies ever made.
Yeah, for sure. And then he went on to do those other ones with Richard Pryor. And he also did other ones with his wife, Gilda Radner. Um, so, yeah, he was a very successful guy. But yeah, you're right. Nobody really talks about him as a great comedian or a great movie star. I don't really hear about him that often. I'm not sure why.
Yeah, underappreciated. The only thing I can think of is he wasn't as flashy as some of the other comedians. He didn't have social commentary. He wasn't edgy. He didn't have the movie star looks. So there could be things that make other people stand out that doesn't make him stand out. If you're not going to talk about issues, if you're not going to get the young, girls in seats and the women in seats, then you don't really have that diehard fan base that really super connect to you. I think he's more like an everyman type
Hmm.
character. And when you're the everyman, you kind of just, almost, I guess who I would compare him to, even though he doesn't really do as much comedy later on in his career, is a Tom Hanks, where he's just more like the
Yeah,
everyman as
yeah,
opposed to this guy who's flashy. Because Tom
yeah.
Hanks really started off with comedy, but he wasn't a flashy guy, but he was in Splash and Big. Again, some of the great comedies,
Hmm.
Forrest Gump. These are all
Yeah,
time great. You may have someone doing a podcast 30 years from now saying, "Hey, this Tom Hanks guy." No one really talks about him, but they're parallel in certain ways.
yeah.
Obviously Tom Hanks did more serious dramas at certain points in his career, but they're both kind of these every man, but they've been in some all-time great movies.
Yeah, I was going to say that maybe Gene Wilder was more of an actor in the sense that he may not have been trying to be as funny as he could be at all moments. He was playing a character, so maybe he doesn't stand out as much as a real comedian who's always trying to get laughs. Maybe he's too much about the character, but that's kind of what makes it great for me. Like a character like Jim here, he feels real to me. He feels like a real guy. He's not just a guy doing shtick. So I
Yeah,
don't know.
I agree to a certain extent, but I don't think you're that funny by accident.
Hmm.
I think you're right. It doesn't look like he's trying. I agree with that, but I think he's that good that it doesn't look like he's trying, rather than like he's just accidentally funny. I think he
Yeah,
is he is funny and he makes it look effortless.
yeah, for sure.
Solid music, solid script, solid direction, solid cast, just an overall great movie. Earlier on, we talked about the fact that there are TV versions of this movie you can see, or network versions, or versions that are going to play certain places where you can see this movie that is truncated, where they'll cut certain things out. But this is a movie that really can't have any cuts to it. And even during the making of the movie, when he submitted the first cut, Mel Brooks did to the studio, they had a list, one of the producers at least had a list of notes that they wanted for him to cut. And according to Brooks, this producer didn't know that Mel had Final Cut. So he took all the notes down, threw it away, and walked out the room and didn't hear from the guy again. But thinking about some of the things that would typically be cut, I do have the things that he mentioned that I'll rattle off now. And it's kind of interesting to think that, all right, if this were made today, could this be made? So they wanted the N-word out. And it's kind of funny that I can't say the word because we're on YouTube and I want this movie, I want this to be monetized. So I can't say it. But it's kind of funny that Mel, not only did he have not a problem writing it back then and having it in the movie, but even in an interview, he kept saying the word, you know. So it's funny. It is kind of still controversial. So they wanted the N-word out. A couple of other words I think I can say, but maybe I shouldn't. So I'll spell it out.
Okay.
This is for an Asian character early on in the movie, Chink.
Yes.
So I don't know if they could say that now. And the F word for homosexual men. So, trying to be very delicate here.
Yes, yes.
The R word for non-consensual sex. And I think I can say this, red face, for the Indians. So some of this stuff is stuff that Mel mentioned, and some of that stuff is notes I made while I was watching it.
Yes.
And then this is strictly from Mel. They wanted him to cut out the horse punching scene, which is one of the, aside from Where the White Women At, that's one of the more iconic scenes in the movie. The bean eating scene where they're farting, that's hilarious. I mean, come on, that's synonymous with this movie. And You're Sucking My Arm. So that line as well. So my question to you, Angus, is with all that considered, do you think this movie could be made today?
Well, I don't know. I think they would have a lot of trouble, and I don't think that they would use some of those words today. And I think Mel Brooks made that comment too, that he said if they made it today, they would get rid of the N-word, and then you would have no movie, you know. So that was his perspective on it. And for me, this goes back to when I was just a beginning writer, beginning playwright, you know, and there was, at that time, the politically correct movement was really on the rise, and they were saying, oh, you can't have a racist character in your play. You can't do it. Otherwise, the play is racist. And most of the smart people of the day said, well, yes, you can. You can have a racist character in your play, and it doesn't make the play racist, because it's a, you know, like in this movie, it's a play about racism, or it's a movie about racism. You have to have racist characters in that, you know, to make your point about racism and racist characters. So it's kind of a weird thing to say we can't do this, even though it's part of the point. We're saying racism is bad, but we can't show it. So it's complicated. And it seems like that's only gotten stronger over time. You know, it seems like now we get to the point where they want to cancel movies, cancel people, whether you call it cancel culture or you call it something else. You know, they say, oh, we shouldn't show this movie anymore because it has the N-word in it. And I don't know. I think that this movie, for example, is very clear in its point of view, and I don't think that I think it's the exact opposite of a racist movie. I think it's very much an anti-racist movie. So I don't know. I don't know if you could convince anybody to do that today and use those words. I don't know. But I think it's a shame.
Yeah, I think the scenes that they wanted to cut out, I don't think there's any issue. Those scenes are pretty tame. As far as the words go, you're right. That's where it gets a little bit more tricky. Because even when you look at a film like Get Out, where it's just all about racism, they never used that word in Get Out. And that's a movie where you would think they would have used it several times. but they never used it once. They never even hinted at it.
Yeah.
So, but that was a movie all about race. So
Yes.
I think you're right. I think not the content, but the words would have to be altered. But I think the
Yeah.
content, I said before when we were reviewing it, that I think the content is fairly tame. It's
Yeah.
just the words are trigger points, you know, and
Yeah.
anyone can just go on Twitter and post those words, and you know, you have talking points and canceling and you know, discussion topics. So, but this is a time capsule. This wasn't made today. This was made almost 50 years ago. Great film. I think we analyze this about as many different ways as you possibly can, and I can't recommend this more. One of the all-time great comedies. Highly recommend it. Even if you're sensitive, as long as you can get past those words, it's a very tame movie. It's a very wholesome movie as well.
It is, and it's got a very good point and a good point of view, and the characters. I mean, one thing I love about this movie, it's something I love about certain movies, that is that even the bad guys are kind of likable in a way. Like everybody's kind of, you know, there's nobody who you really hate. You know, you kind of enjoy watching Headley, you know, do his thing, and you know, he's funny, right? And you just kind of enjoy watching these characters. It doesn't seem like it's like a really dark story with characters who you really, really hate. And a lot of the characters do have an arc where they learn, you know, they learn not to be racist or judgmental. And, you know, I think it's, yeah, it is a very, I mean, it was like a PG movie when it came out. It wasn't even rated R, you know. Yeah, so I really like it, and I think it holds up well. One thing that we didn't say, or that I didn't say, is talking about the red face. Apparently, there's a couple of reasons why Mel Brooks did that, and they're both kind of clever. One is that a lot of the old westerns featured Jews and Italians playing the Indians, the indigenous characters in the movie. And so by having, you know, him, a Jewish man, play the Indian character, speaking Yiddish, you know, he's like clearly Jewish. It's kind of a reference to that. But it's also that apparently before the Civil War, there was a theory that was going around that the native people of North America were actually descended from the Jews. And so this was something people would have known about and talked about back then. And so by showing them as Jewish in this movie, he's kind of poking fun at that theory, which of course has no basis in any kind of fact. It was just a theory that somebody put forward.
Mel Gibson?
Perhaps. I don't know. Yeah, so anyway.
Too young. He was too young to push that forward.
Yeah. So I think he was making a comedic point by doing that red face, which nowadays he probably would get in trouble for. They would say, just don't do it. You know, just don't do that.
Be better.
Yeah. You know, so, you know, fair enough, I suppose.